welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic, our new live show launching today. I am so excited, and thank you to our producer, Christopher Leonard, who has put this all together for me. I'm so excited. And I am bringing on a regular guest and a regular contributor to Responsible Statecraft. Branko Marcetic is here to join us. I'm so appreciative because he has just written, and let me introduce Branko as well. He is a staff writer with Jacobin magazine. He's also the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. He also writes often for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you very much, Branko, and has been published in the Washington Post, The Guardian, and other outlets. And he's going to spend a little time with me today talking about an article he wrote for RS on the Iran war, but specifically taking a look at, as you're seeing right on the screen right now, the title, Not So Diplomatic, Witkoff, Kushner, and Trump's March to War in Iran. Branko, you take a closer look at, and welcome, by the way.
Yeah, always good to be with you.
Now you're taking a close look at the two men at the spear point of the war when it all blew up, or at the spear point of the negotiations when it all blew up, and we went to war on February 28th. In fact, you point out that several observers have concluded that the war might have been started because Witkoff and Kushner's lack of nuclear knowledge, and because they lacked the technical expertise to even understand what the Iranians were offering in the negotiations. But their ineptitude seems to be getting no attention today. Can you walk us through who exactly these two men are, what qualified them for this job as chief negotiators, and what is it maybe on purpose that they were chosen to lead these ill-fated talks, which many now are thinking were a ruse to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying from the get-go that I think we're still sorting out what exactly happened. It may be months, years before we actually really know what led to the decision to declare war, and maybe we will never even know. This is at this point kind of a Rashomon-like scenario where we have different accounts from different people, and I'm sure as time goes on and the war becomes more and more of a political disaster, the incentive for some of those involved to kind of change their account or fudge the truth or whatever will grow. So we are trying to sort out this tangled mess and figure out what actually went on. But it sounds like from both multiple reports at the time, at the start of the war, and from Trump's own public comments, that what Witkoff and Kushner reported to him about how the negotiations were going was a instrumental part in his decision to launch the war. That maybe if they had said to him, we have made progress in talks, they're going well, that may have forestalled his decision on March 1st to go and attack Iran. But it seems like they did not say that. And so the question is, why did they not tell him? Why did they tell him that the talks were not bearing fruit? To give a bit of background on these two guys, I mean, Trump is renowned for kind of trusting his own people. He doesn't like the deep state. He doesn't trust kind of career government officials. He thinks that they are out to undermine his foreign policy, and there's truth to that. Someone like John Bolton, for instance, famously did undermine Trump's diplomatic efforts with North Korea. So Trump sometimes tends to put his faith into some of these more sort of informal arrangements. These people that he has a relationship with that aren't government officials, that aren't sort of long-serving experts, but they're people he trusts. In this case, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and then Steve Witkoff, who is an old real estate friend of his. Now, maybe those are good credentials for people that Trump is willing to put his faith in, that he knows are not going to undermine his orders, undermine his goals in negotiations. But it also means that you have two people who are not very well versed in the extremely complicated technical nuclear negotiations, and also are not necessarily versed in the complicated history of U.S.-Iranian relations. Do not know about some of the kind of Iranian viewpoint of this history and why they may have certain red lines in talks and so on. And also it has to be said that both of these guys, particularly Kushner, are people who are very closely aligned with Israel and who see, who have a emotional connection to Israel, who view Israeli and U.S. interests as if not the same, as very much, closely aligned. And so I think number one, that has the potential to undermine some of the trust in them, certainly from the Iranian side. But number two, it means that they could be swayed perhaps by the what we know as a months-long Israeli campaign to try and push for this war. Or worse, if you take some of the Gulf diplomats' words for it, who were involved in negotiations, they believed they were outright agents for Israel, and they were kind of undermining the talks so that they could guarantee that war happened. I'm not saying that did happen. We don't know, but all of that does not make for it doesn't exactly guarantee success for negotiations, I think.
I mean, do you think that they're getting enough scrutiny by the press? I mean, you have these two guys who basically were heralded by, particularly Witkoff, as heroes in Israel. You saw them shuttling back and forth. And a lot of this was because they were at the spear point of the Gaza ceasefire negotiations. So they go from mediating or being part of establishing a ceasefire in Gaza, got all the credit for that, helping to establish the new board of peace with Trump, and then shifting over to these Iranian talks. I mean, and then it all blows up. Witkoff is out on Fox News basically saying, hey, we were going to give them this, that, and the other thing, and they told us to go jump off a bridge. This started a whole narrative within the conservative, pro-war world, where they said, hey, Trump was trying to negotiate. He was going to give them everything. And they just they said no, which turned out not to be true. But you have Witkoff actually starting a rumor, essentially, to establish a baseline for who was at fault for this war. And then they just kind of quietly go away into the shadows with no actual scrutinization. Are you surprised by this? And I agree with you. I think the background and the connection to Israel, particularly on Kushner's end, in which his family is good friends with Benjamin Netanyahu. We all know the anecdote about how Benjamin Netanyahu used his bedroom when he'd come to visit. His parents have been funders of very conservative right-wing settlements in the West Bank, which are illegal internationally. So to think that he was a fair broker and what is turned out to be the most fraught and volatile foreign policy situation in the United States seems to be it's stunning that the press isn't giving this more play.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, some of what we know about what has happened, what has transpired over there, has been because of some of the mainstream reporting about the negotiations. I mean, NBC and MS Now, for instance, did some of the key reporting where they kind of talked to Gulf diplomats and others who were involved in negotiations. They found that, basically these guys seem to not really be familiar with some of the really key technical aspects of the talks, which really made them harder. At the same time, we also know some of this because of public statements that the two have made, and also because of a briefing that the White House did to reporters. But these are just a kind of a handful of stories here and there that I think have shed light on it, but I think have not, when it comes to, mass kind of media focus on this and scrutiny. I think that has not really happened. It's just sort
No.
of we see Witkoff kind of appear on Fox and other networks, and now kind of disseminating what sound like ultra hawkish talking points about Iran, but he is treated very uncritically, at least from what I have seen. Whether it's Fox or CNBC, um, his account of what happened has been sort of taken, as just sort of gospel, and obviously this is what transpired. But then, meanwhile, you have others who are involved speaking to outlets like Dropsite here in the US or Almaj Media, for instance, saying, "Well, hold on, that's not at all." The account of what happened. I mean, to give you one example, Witkoff made a claim in here in the US. I can't remember which network it was, but basically saying, "Oh, the Iranians didn't want to talk. They were being very sort of stubborn and resistant." And one of the examples he used to illustrate this was that he said, they told us straight away, we will not give you, diplomatically, or what you cannot achieve militarily, or something along those lines. That line apparently did happen, but it was a very different, had a very different meaning when it was originally presented. Where they were trying to say to the Americans, don't kind of bite off more than you can chew. Don't make demands that are overly kind of aggressive and grandiose. Ultimately, you have to be a little pragmatic. That's sort of what they were trying to say.
Yeah.
But in Witkoff's retelling, it kind of is meant to be this presentation of, oh, well, the Iranians clearly didn't want to negotiate. And then, there's a number of other cases like that that we could go through that where Witkoff has presented it in public, seemingly as a way to kind of justify the decision to go to war. But others who were present there said, well, hold on, that's not really at all what the Iranians were saying.
I mean, I'm absolutely flabbergasted to think that Kushner and Witkoff are now shuttling back and forth to try to save, repair, whatever, apply emergency like services to the Ukraine war talks. They are still heading those talks. And so Witkoff had just emerged from the summit with the Ukrainians this weekend, saying that that they were making considerable progress. No details, no details. Meanwhile, the Russians said, "We're putting this thing on pause. Well, we'll get back to you when we want to re-engage." Are you surprised, or do you think that they've really lost the thread on the Ukraine war negotiations after proving to the world that they can't do the job in Iran, and have set the Middle East on fire, essentially?
Well, I mean, it sounds like basically entrusting negotiations to end two major wars that the US is to varying degrees involved in to just two guys, two basically real estate guys that
Yeah.
the president knows from New York, has caused exactly the kind of problems that you could imagine. I mean, according to reports, Witkoff and Kushner, at the same time as they were involved in these incredibly delicate, difficult talks with Iran, they had to be kind of balancing it with, well, looking at the watch and saying, well, we have to be, talking with the Russians and the Ukrainians and in a little bit, So, I mean, you can imagine just in your own life, if you have multiple appointments in a day, how that would reduce the effectiveness of anything that you're going to do. You're going to be, not focused on the particular job at hand because you're thinking of what you're having to do next. This is what these guys are doing, with these incredibly complicated conflicts that have really tangled histories. And yet they are having to try and end both of them. They don't have any team of experts with them. They don't have a larger set of State Department officials that are kind of helping them do this.
No.
It seems like from accounts, it seems like they are at times kind of cramming, as if they are about to do a exam the next night, having to cram before the talks to sort of understand some of the basic issues involved. I think people have pointed out that the only person that in U.S. history that has kind of achieved things similar to this is Henry Kissinger. And whatever you want to say about Henry Kissinger, he's obviously an incredibly smart man who was steeped in these foreign policy issues. These guys are coming from the private sector and are having to kind of learn, diplomacy and foreign policy on the go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not surprised that these talks in both cases have not really gone as planned.
Chris had put up that full screen of the Board of Peace, which is just stalled. So you hadn't mentioned the third major war that these two have been involved in, as the ceasefire we mentioned earlier in Gaza. So they get they get this big play for establishing a board of peace. There's going to be billions of dollars invested, apparently or supposedly, and the Iran war is touched off, launched, board of peace. Who's even talking about it anymore? And so, and we know that actual lives are being affected here because no aid is getting in. There's the reconciliation process has been stalled. This international security team that's supposed to go in there, it has not been formed yet. So yeah, that's like failure number 3 that we're talking about here. I mean, you must not be surprised regarding the Board of Peace and where that's at right now.
No, yeah, I mean, the Board of Peace, I think the kind of failure of that is baked in, and not just because of the kind of self-dealing that is involved in it, but also, it's the problem is fundamentally that Israel's kind of resistance to really just properly ending the war there and actually ending its presence in Gaza. So I mean, until all of that is fixed, I think the Board of Peace is of course going to be a failure. I mean, and probably even more so now that all these Gulf countries are being attacked as a result of U.S. actions and as a result of U.S. indulgence of Israel. Now they're going, well, hold on, we basically put in all this money into things like the Board of Peace, as a kind of understanding that this will be a quid pro quo, that we, put money in your pocket and you kind of, do things in our interest, and actually that's not happening at all. So what is the point of any of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's go on to what's been, the last 24 hours. Chris, you have a cut 6 on Trump's latest attempt to try to find an off-ramp here.
Ministry says you're not telling the truth when it comes to productive conversations to end the war.
Well, they're going to have to get themselves better public relations people. We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement. I would say almost all points of agreement. Perhaps that hasn't been conveyed. The communication, as you know, has been blown to pieces. They're unable to talk to each other. But we've had very strong talks. Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner had them. They went, I would say, perfectly. I would say that if they carry through with that, it'll end that problem, that conflict. And I think it'll end it very, very substantially. We have very much in mind our partners in the Middle East. We've had great relationships with a lot of them, as you know. A lot of them were surprisingly hit, and I was surprised to see it, and so was everyone else. But we have, they're very much in mind in the discussions. So the discussions took place yesterday. They went into yesterday evening. They want very much to make a deal. We'd like to make a deal too.
Okay, so we have that, and then the Iranians say, no such talks have ever occurred. I mean, and I didn't even know, I noticed that he said that Kushner and Witkoff were actually in attendance of these talks. So the dynamic duo is back, supposedly, talking to Iranians who claim that they have had no direct contact. And other comments or stories that we've seen online, this Iranian speaker of their parliament, I'm sorry, I'll butcher his name, but it's like Galafid, supposedly the top man that Trump is speaking to, and there just seems to be no evidence of this. The Qataris say they are absolutely not engaging in any mediation, and they were the mediators in all of these conflicts, whether it be Gaza and Iran in the past. They're just trying to defend themselves from attacks coming from Tehran. What do you make of this, what I'm seeing as a desperate gambit by Trump to find an off-ramp or just to keep the prices in the markets from absolutely imploding?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It seems like it is Trump again, both trying to kind of wish into existence some kind of into the war and to calm the markets. Like you said, the Iranians have pretty steadfastly denied that there are any talks happening. There was a report in Turkish media this morning that it's true that Iran has not had talks, but there have been messages sent through intermediaries. So perhaps the situation is a little more hopeful than the most kind of cynical or pessimistic reads of Trump's comments. But in any case, it's certainly true that Trump is way overstating, I think, the degree to which there's any negotiations happening, and Iran's even willingness to kind of come to the table after they were, let's not forget, attacked twice in the middle of negotiations.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think regardless whether talks happen, whether they're happening, whether they happen in the future, I think the big takeaway for me is I do not see how Witkoff and Kushner can be involved in these talks. Not just because they have repeatedly demonstrated pretty gross incompetence and ignorance of the basic things involved to make these talks successful, but also just that they've clearly lost the trust of the negotiators. The Iranians, quite understandably, from reports, they seem to view them as agents of Israel, as people who, whether they were doing it at Trump's behest or whether they were doing it, at Netanyahu's behest, basically were trying to undermine any sort of diplomatic solution to this problem. And I think the other problem that we haven't talked about, I don't think he mentioned it in that clip we just saw, but Trump was asked, who are you talking about? Who are you talking to at the moment? He mentioned the Iranian speaker. Well, no, sorry. He mentioned, we're talking to someone a very top official. They said, who specifically? And he said, well, I can't tell you because I don't want him to be killed. And that's an extraordinary statement from the President of the United States. He is basically implying, well, if I reveal who it is that we're trying to make a deal with, then that means our partner in the region, our great ally Israel, will assassinate him because they are committed to undermining my own foreign policy goals and my own attempt to end this war. It's one of those classic Trump admissions that a more seasoned politician would never make, but he just kind of gives us this incredibly revealing tidbit, which, again, makes us question, to what extent is both the president and the United States government even, fully in charge of its own foreign policy?
Absolutely. I know we're kind of running out of time here because I wanted to talk about how the warmongers, like your Lindsey Grahams, for example, and, Ben Shapiro, Laura Loomer, Mark Levin, everybody who's been banging the drum for this war are not going to be too happy to see Trump, looking so desperate to end this war. They don't want to end the war. They want full regime change. And they've been talking about it. I think we have a cut from Dershowitz. I think we'll play that one because that's pretty revealing.
Or since 1939, since Nazi Germany. If Iran is allowed to develop nuclear bombs, he will do what Hitler did, and there will be millions and millions of deaths. Had President Trump been in charge in 1935, 1936, I think the Holocaust would have been prevented. I think he would have gone in after Nazi Germany. He would have destroyed it the way he is destroying Nazi Iran, and the Holocaust would have been prevented.
Does this sound like a guy that wants an off-ramp? I don't think so. And he represents a lot of people in the national security establishment, particularly those retirees who are working with JINSA and the Israeli military establishment, as well as our political establishment, that sees this as an existential conflict. This is not about getting an off-ramp and making a nuclear deal. This is about wiping out Iran. And let's just go to Chris. Let's go to Netanyahu, because I think we know how this is going when you hear what Netanyahu has to say about Trump's comments yesterday.
With our friend, President Trump. President Trump believes there is a chance to leverage the tremendous achievements of the IDF and the U.S. military to realize the objectives of the war in an agreement that will safeguard our vital interests. At the same time, we continue to strike both in Iran and in Lebanon. We are disrupting the missile program and the thin nuclear program, and we continue to inflict heavy damage on Hezbollah. Just a few days ago, we eliminated 2 more nuclear scientists, and this is only the beginning. We will safeguard our vital interest under any circumstances.
Branko, how long do you think this war is going to go on?
Oh, geez. I mean, you would hope not much longer. I mean, it sounds like basically with every day that this war goes on, that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, that, supply chains are disrupted, that the knock-on effect, it adds another, month or several weeks to the potential impact of that. And we in the US are not feeling it yet. There's other parts of the world that are not feeling it yet, but with the Ukraine war, that it was similarly. It initially, Biden at the time said, "Well, look, people are just going to have to pay more at the pump for a while until this war is drawn to a close, until we defeat Russia," and that was maybe a palatable message for a while. But what happened was, months down the line, you started to see all those supply chain disruptions actually start to factor into the prices that people are paying, and particularly in Europe. I mean, people's gas costs just went through the roof. I don't know how much longer it's going to take. I mean, there was some indications that Iran was willing to basically endure until, or at least Iranian leadership was willing to endure this war, for months, until, closer to the midterms, to sort of inflict a political cost on Trump. If that's true, I mean, already this crisis, the fossil fuel crisis that's resulted from the closing of the Strait is, according to people, who work in the field, it's eclipsed the 70s oil shocks, and it's eclipsed the Ukraine war already. Those are the two kind of biggest inflationary crises of the past few decades. And this war is we are not even a month into this war. So imagine if this lasts for, 3 or even 6 months or longer. It'll be pretty terrible. Meanwhile, on the US side, you do have the Trump administration talking about getting $200 billion for the war, which again suggests a months and months long war that they are planning for. And there have been reports that have come out that kind of suggest as much, that they're thinking of this as a very long war.
Yeah.
So, it seems like it might be a long time. I hope not. I think if there's any hope of it not being so, I think someone like Witkoff and Kushner cannot be involved in these negotiations if they do happen with what's left of Iranian leadership.
Absolutely not. I mean, I guess we can leave, or try to leave this on a little bit of a higher note. I mean, public opinion is going into the toilet on this war. I've not seen anything like this in my lifetime. So when I sort of came of age, I was in college or just going into college during the first Persian Gulf War. I mean, the country was mobilized to support the United States military and going after Saddam Hussein and protecting Kuwait. There were some lone voices against the war, but they were very marginalized. The same with the Iraq War in 2003. People have pointed to polls in which, upwards of 70-something% of the American public was in support of the invasion. It wasn't until the insurgencies began and the cracks in that whole strategy started showing that people started peeling off. With this war, the majority of Americans have said the invasion was wrong and they want to get out. And we had a poll, a Quincy Institute / American Conservative poll that found, the vast majority of Trump voters want him to find the exits immediately. So can you, just as a closing, maybe a moment of optimism, maybe it will be the pressure from the public that will force Trump to a real negotiating table?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting because I think at the beginning, kind of, people who identified as MAGA Republicans were the most supportive of the war, by a massive margin, 90 something percent, and it seemed like even though there was opposition on the right to the war, it was mostly among kind of like, right-wing influencers and people who are kind of more on the, for lack of a better word, on the elite side of things. But it does seem like that has now filtered down increasingly into, kind of the rank and file of Trump's base, not just people who are enthusiastic Trump voters, but people who, voted for him as well, just, maybe weren't as committed, but thought, hey, this guy's going to keep us in war, and so on and so forth. So it does seem like that is being seen and digested by Trump's advisors, who obviously understand that this is an election year, and a lot of things could go wrong politically for Trump if the Democrats end up sweeping all the different races this November. So the optimistic thing is not just that there's pressure on Trump from below and from kind of some of the influential voices in the right-wing orbit, but also that this maybe shows to Iran that, hey, the political cost that you wanted to inflict on Trump, you have actually achieved that. Not only has he, has this war been really a failure, it's failed in all of its main initial goals. And Iran has, demonstrated its ability to withstand U.S. attack and its ability to really bring the global economy to its knees. But then also at the same time, they have shown how they are able to, influence a U.S. president's political fortunes by, potentially kind of dragging the United States or pulling the United States into a really bloody quagmire. And so hopefully what will happen is both of those sides decide, okay, we've had enough. Trump goes, make sure they win in November. The Iranians go, great. We've shown that if they attack us again, we can really do some damage. The one variable that I will add in this optimistic scenario that now I'm going to maybe undermine is of course Israel. What does Israel, what does Netanyahu want to do? Is Trump willing to rein in Israel in a way that he hasn't over the past year or so? That's going to be the big question, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I so much enjoyed having you back on the show and the first guest on our new and improved show. Thank you, Christopher, for amazing presentation and production. I love it. I love it. And Branko, I hope you'll come back. For those watching, Branko can be found at Jacobin magazine, and also his X account is right there. I believe. Wait, I don't think so. So Branko, can you just quickly tell us where we can find you on X?
Yeah, sure. It's at B and then my last name, Marcetic, but with H's after the C's, which is not how it's spelled, but it helps explain to people how actually you're meant to say the name.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Branko, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.